All right. So let me share the screen. Okay. So yesterday, what we were dealing with is different permutations of where you want to make sure that there's no opportunity to forge, filling in blank space that's left over. We were talking about margins yesterday, that you want to try and make sure that the witnesses sign all the way on the right side of the paper, because if there's a margin that indents, even if it indents consistent with flush with the body of the text, the problem is that someone could just snip off the body of the text when you're dealing with a large right side margin and just fill in stuff and use the witnesses' signatures that way. So that's the reason why it's better not to have a large space in the margin. What we do find sometimes is with a ketubah, they will not right align the witnesses' signatures, but they will center align the witnesses, the lines. And what we're seeing from here is it's better probably to right align the signatures. So sheyachol zayef, the Kate said yasel minozos, yitayetenu bidyo. Anytime you find a large amount of blank space, it's all.
Did it freeze for you guys?
Yeah, it's frozen. Yeah, I don't know what's going on?
It's some issues.
Rabbi,
you cut off for like the past 15 seconds. We couldn't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thanks for pointing that out. Any star, what we were just saying is that any star that is forgeable, even though it's not forged, is not kosher. And then in this piece, Kufnun Ches, Pasal She'afal Pi Shalonis Dayev, he says, Be'emes De'ika Bazeh Plugta Bein HaPoskim. There's a machlokus HaPoskim here. V'yesh machshirim oso mishum deshtar ze eno yachol lihizdayev. What he's talking about over here, B'chol shar sheyuchal lihizdayev pasul afal pi shelo nizdayev. Any star that could be forged is not kosher, even if it hasn't been forged. And he says that the truth is this is a machlokus. He says some people say that a star, I'm not sure what he means by this, because we just got through saying that it has to be forgeable in order for it to be puzzle. Welcome back. Okay.
Again? Yeah.
What's going on?
Hi, everybody. I'm sorry about that. Let me bring everything back up. I just plugged in the thing to the network so that hopefully we won't have this problem again. But we really do need to speak to our tech people to make sure that this doesn't continue. Okay. Can everybody hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks. So he says, I'm not really sure why why the Rav Shulchan Aruch says automatically that just because a shtar has a lot of white space or a lot of margin, it's automatically puzzle. He says because not everyone holds that that's puzzle, because there's always a remedy. Okay. He says, "Achmasha kasav lekaman sif lamed vav dehecha diyuchali izdayef puzzle gamri bazeleka plugta." Let's wait till we get to Sif Lamed Vav to be able to understand what he's saying here, because he doesn't really make a lot of sense. I'm not really sure what he's. The language is unclear in this Sif, so in this little commentary, but we will get back to it. The last thing that we had seen in this Sif is that in the event that the shtar ends in the middle of the line, sometimes it's actually better for the witnesses to fill in that blank space with their signatures instead of starting a new line. And the reason for that is because if there's let's say a half a line or 3/4 of a line that remains blank, and then you have a blank line underneath that because the witnesses can't always align their signatures to make it flush against the body of the text, you're allowing too much blank space for someone to fill something in afterwards and to do that whole shtick with erasing hakol sharir v'kayam, etc. He says, "Ve'ein bazeh shum chisaron." There's nothing wrong with witnesses filling in the blank space of a line that is already started. And actually, some say that it's actually better to do it that way, as we'll see shortly. So let's go on to Lamed Vav, or actually, there's one more little piece. He writes, "Shabal Shar Hosif Zeshrei Ena de Misham Lahaniach Chalak Lifnei Chasimasam Keshachos Mimzeh Eitzel Zeh." So what he was saying over here is, he says, "Ein tzarich lahachzir minyano shel shtar afilu b'chatzi shita hachrona u'lemeidin mimena kol zchus shekasuv ba." He says, in that kind of situation, you wouldn't need to do a summation in the last line because it's clear that this is the end of the shtar. She'ein lachush klal shabal hashtar hosif seh. He says you wouldn't have to worry that somebody forged any additional text. Because if the witnesses, let's say, are signing on the left side of the shtar, they're signing their signatures in Hebrew, so then if there was any blank space, they wouldn't have been able to do that. They would have known not to left align their signatures. So it's clear that in a situation like that, where you see the witness's signature on the last line of the contract itself, you know that it hasn't been forged. And he writes, he says, "Umukminan ha'idim achez kasaihu, dim lo hayu ro'in sha'ashtar hayu kasuv gam ba'oso chatzishur shekodam chasimasan lo hayu chasmin al zeh be'emtza ashur." We can assume witnesses would not have signed in the middle of a line or at the left side of the page if there wasn't any text before their signatures. Shaharei yachol lezayfa v'lasus mimenu shtar ve'edav b'shita echas, because as we said before, if they would have done that, they would have known that this was subject to falsification, and they never would have signed their names in the middle or the end of a line. As a matter of fact, the Ramban had actually taught scribes to finish the last line of the text of a shtar in the middle of a line, and had advocated that the witnesses fill in the other half a line that's blank with their signatures. And that way, you're sort of compacting everything into one body of text, which makes it even less subject to falsification. Okay, we don't do that. Generally, we don't do that. But one thing I do know is that even in secular contracts, let's say you're drafting a contract and the body of the text of the contract ends at the bottom of the page. So the signature page for the witnesses is on a completely different page. So isn't there something that you have to put up on top of the witnesses' signatures or something like that?
Very hard not to just have that, because you can sign that to attach that to anything.
That's right. That's right. So I've noticed that they try not to do that.
So there's number of pages also, but yeah, you wouldn't end the contract with just the text.
Understand.
You'd extend the page, maybe make a couple or more,
Right, so you can
spaces.
see the follow.
So at least one line of.
But we don't indenture our contracts anymore. It was very interesting, that article. Okay, let's go on to the next piece. Let's go on to the next sieve. Lamed Vav. V'imlo yachtamu b'chatzi shita hanishar. He says, if the witnesses do not sign, let's say you have the body of the text ends in the middle of the line. And instead of the witnesses filling in the remaining blank space on that line, they sign their names below the body of the text at the beginning of a new line. Yipasel hashtar legamre im lo yitzamtzemu lachtom samach lichtav miyad. The shtar could potentially be a puzzle shtar with all of that blank space, unless they align their signatures so closely to the body of the text where they don't even leave any blank space. V'yanichu kedei rochav shita if they sheyachol lezayev. In other words, they would have to really leave not more than a line of blank space, because if they left any more blank space, the shtar is forgeable. V'lichtov b'chatzi shita hanishar mashi yirtzeh v'yachzur minyano shel shtar b'shita achrona. He says because the reason why they can't leave a full line of blank space, which we normally allow, is because when you have, let's say, a half of a line plus the line that they're leaving over between their signatures and the text could actually lead to falsification. There's too much space. They could fill in whatever they want and do a summation, and the chol shar sheyachol yizdayef puzzle. Because as we said, any shtar that is forgeable, even though it's currently not forged, is going to be puzzle. Va'afim kasav sharir v'kayam b'siyam hashtar yachol lamachko v'lichtov mashi yirtzu l'kayim hamachak v'chatzi shita hanishar shi lifnei achrona sheyosef kamo shenispar l'mayla. And even if they wrote kol sharir v'kayam and that last line of the shtar that ends in the middle of the line, they could always, someone who wanted to forge it could always erase it and say, we filled in the words only if my wife consents to this deal over an erased piece of parchment. And then afterwards they write on the next line, Hakol Shavir V'Kayam, and everything could be forged. So therefore you can't allow for a lot of space between what the body of the text and what the witnesses sign. Sheyachol L'Zayef. So he says, V'chol Ashtar Pasul, Afim Bala based in Legabos Bo, V'adain Lo Nichtov Klum, V'Hashura V'Chatzi Sheini Chureka. So therefore, the Beis Din will not even admit that contract. In other words, even if everything was done correctly, the body of the text was written expertly by the scribe, and the witness is signed very carefully, but there's 1.5 lines of blank space. He says that's not going to be admitted by the Beis Din. He says, because since it's something that is subject to forgery, we would not have detected the forgery if someone had chosen to forge it. Like we learned previously, it's like two witnesses signing their signatures on the same line, where there's a lot of blank space above their signatures, where anyone could have just snipped off the body of the text and just used that little slip of paper like we learned yesterday. We would not admit that shtar in Beis Din because it's too fishy, right? Similarly, over here, we will not admit any shtar in Beis Din that could have that done to it. Okay, let's go on to that, because this is really just becoming repetitive. Lamed Zayin. Uv'chol hadinim hatluyim b'meh she'ein ha'edim yachol litzamtzem samuch lichtav miyad hu hadin im hamitchayev chatam ba'atzmo eno yachol litzamtzem. He says, just like we've explained that the witnesses themselves cannot have difficulty because they're not expert scribes, they have difficulty aligning their handwriting of their signatures to the body of the text. The same thing is true if the creditor or debtor, usually it's the debtor, is also a signatory. Because like we learned before many times, and we do this in secular law today, we have the party of interest sign the contract, not just the witnesses, right? So if the party of interest, let's say the debtor, is signing a promissory note, I owe you, and we're going to have him sign his names, and then the witnesses sign below, the same law will apply, that the debtor can't align his signature because he's not an expert scribe. So he's invariably going to be leaving a line of blank space. V'yesh lachu shemahiniach kedei rochav shita. V'kasav ba'al hashtar masharatza. U'lakach tzarich lachzar mi'inyano shel shtar levad b'shita ha'achrona. And that's why here too, even when the debtor is going to be signing, you have to write v'hakol shavir v'kayam at the end of the line, do a summation and write v'hakol shavir v'kayam. Ach im kol hashtar hu ktivat yado ein lachush lazeh. But that's only true if you had a professional scribe write the promissory note and then you have the guy sign his name. But if, let's say, he writes it out in his own handwriting, the debtor, he's writing the promissory note, and then he signs his name, so then you don't have to worry that he's not going to be able to align his signature because he's more comfortable in his own, you see that he's able to write. And the same thing would be true. If, let's say, one of the witnesses writes the contract himself in his own handwriting and then signs his name, you don't have to worry that there's been a blank space, that the blank space may be doctored. So who asked about writing on both sides? Was that you, Mordechai, yesterday? So now the Rav Shulchan Aruch addresses that. He says there are certain contracts that are customary in our countries. He's speaking about 18th century Russia or Poland, okay, Eastern Europe. And he says that there's a custom that we write the amount of money that is being owed on the other side of the page, neged chasimas yad hamischayev, that corresponds to the signature of the debtor on the side that he's signing. In other words, what they used to do is they would write out a promissory note, the guy would sign it, the debtor would sign it, and then they would flip it over the piece of paper, and they would write the amount of money that is owed corresponding on the other side, corresponding to his signature. And I guess that was maybe done to ensure that no one could erase the amount in the body of the text and put in a different amount. So they would write it in on the opposite side, on the other side of the page. So you have to be careful, using our convention, he says, to make sure that the amount that you fill in on the other side of the page is actually completely corresponding to the signature, and that it's not above it or below it, afilu shita echad, even by one line. If they shiachol lezayev ilichtov lemaila mehachasima sach gadol, v'yachtoch lemata mehachasima sach hamos shebehefach hadaf. He says, because if it's not perfectly aligned and it's written slightly below, a guy could always cut off that amount, fill in a new amount. He says, "V'yachtoch lamata mechsach hamos shebehefach hadaf im chasimas yad ha'edim shekenegda," using the signature of the witnesses, let's say, that is opposite that amount. So what would they do? So apparently, he said, let's just explain how they did this little thing. He says, let's look at the Imrei Yaakov. Im hamischayev chasam ba'atzmo. If the debtor signs it also on the shtar, the imhirchik kama shuros misof hashtar b'chasam atzmo below chasha shema Yosef bal hashtar o yachtachenu v'yichtov shtar chadash mishum deminu lebal hashtar let's say the debtor signs his name and there's a significant space between his signature and the body of the text because he believes that the creditor will not forge the document. Yesh omrim de'en lifso lahashtar, afim hashtar lo nichtav b'chtav yado, rak chasam atzmo aleha. He says some people say that in that situation, since we're not dealing with witnesses' signatures, we're dealing with the debtor himself, you can still say that that shtar is kosher. Why? He says because everyone has the right to put himself at risk. In other words, if a person says, I'm willing to risk signing my name on a contract that clearly is forgeable, but I trust the person who's holding on to the contract that he's not going to play games. So some poskim say that that's perfectly legitimate and the Beis Din will accept that. Why should we as the Beis Din disqualify something that he himself willfully entered into, right? And so therefore there's a machlokis over there. He says, V'ayin lekaman demashma v'divrei harav de lo svir lekin, but the Rav Shulchan Aruch apparently doesn't hold that way. He holds that even if the debtor himself signs it in a way that makes it forgeable, we should not admit the shtar. So now Rav Stern is going to clarify what the practice was in the times of the Rav Shulchan Aruch. So what does he say? He says, Kavanaso al shtaros demiskari mamarna. He says there was a certain kind of contract that was called mamarna. And I'm not sure what language that is, but let's see. He says, V'zeloshon halavush. And the Lavush, who lives probably at least a century before the Rav Shulchan Aruch, writes as follows: Gufa shel hamamarna kachu, halove chotem shemo al niyar chalak b'tzad echad. He says what happens is that the debtor signs his name on a blank piece of paper on one side of the paper. Ve'ein kosev bo klum ba'osod tzad rak chasimaso. So the practice was that you would not write anything on that side of the paper except for the signature of the debtor. Ubetzad hasheni keneged chasimaso mamish kosev alav bifnei halo vesikam hamos shechayev lo. He says on the other side of the paper, in the presence of the debtor, you would then write the amount of money that he is indebting himself, uzman hapiraon, and the date of when that loan is due. Shekevin shekosav zeh keneged chasimaso mamish betzad hasheni ein kan cheshash ziyuf klal. And the Lavush writes is that since the fellow's signature is exactly corresponding on the other side of the paper to the amount, you don't have to worry about counterfeiting. She'im eino mamish keneged chasimaso efshel lezayif. But if it's not exactly corresponding to the signature on the other side of the paper, then it would be subject to forgery. Because then you could snip off, you could cut off the amount and the terms on the other side of the paper that is not corresponding to his signature, and fill in on the other side that corresponds to his signature, whatever you want. Ukadei latet reshut lamalva sheyichtov lamayla kol shufrei d'shtare. And what basically you do is that you would on the side where the guy signs his name, they would allow the creditor to fill in all the other formal text of the shtar, kegon ne'emanus ushar inyanim shehu tovas amalva, such as the wherefores and the therefores of all of the terms of the shtar, such as that the malva is trustworthy to use this as an instrument of collection of the debt, etc., etc., etc. And the debtor basically trusts the malva that he can fill in whatever he wants on the side of his signature because he has that sense of assuredness that since the amount and the date of the payback corresponds to his signature on the other side, he knows that whatever else he fills in is not going to make a difference. Ulakach posken al hamamarna kol din ne'emanus. And it's on that basis that the Beis Din will accept this kind of promissory note, because it's sort of bulletproof in a sense. The tokef v'chozeh kol hashtaros al hasach uzman pirona kosov mitzido hasheni. He says because the whole strength of that of collection on that note is based on the amount and the date that's on the other side. V'husha kosov mitzido hasheni kach kamosha kosavti. Dainu sachov zeh kach v'kach uzman pirono biyom kach v'kach v'lo yoter. But that's provided that it's written in the way that we've explained, that you write down the amount and the date it's due, and that's all you write corresponding to his signature on the other side. And even if it's the handwriting of the creditor, it's still acceptable. And we give the holder of that promissory note believability. Since the debtor gave him a carte blanche by signing his name on a blank piece of paper. So we basically trust that the creditor had the debtor's complete permission to fill in all of the other text that appears above his signature. And that's generally, that could be done. Let's say you have a debtor who's desperate to borrow money, and we don't have the time. He's desperate. He needs to drive off from Minsk to Pinsk, and the carriage is leaving, and there's no time for him to wait for this whole shtar to be written. So they decide, let's do it quickly. I'll sign my name. We'll write down the amount that I owe on the other side and the date that it's due. You fill in the rest. I trust you, because that's really, so that's perfectly legal, and that's an instrument that can be collected on in Beis Din. But what the Rav Shulchan Aruch is saying is that you have to be sure that the amount that's written on the other side does fully overlap the signature, because if not, then a person could easily, let's say if it's written below the signature, a person could snip off the amount that was written on the other side. He says it's no longer going to look like a mamarna contract, which is this specific type of contract where the signature is written on a blank piece of paper. Because once you've snipped right below his signature, it no longer looks like a mamarna, because no one signs a mamarna contract with leaving no margin on the bottom. But you could still use it. But you could use it as a regular shtar by filling in on the same side of his signature anything that you want. You could fill in your own terms, make up whatever number you want, make up whatever date you want, and it's going to be a problem. So that's the issue that we are dealing with. Okay, so let me just see. No. So we're saying the guy writes his signature on one side, and then the amount and the date due on the other side. So and the amount and the date due corresponds to the signature. It's on the other side. Yeah. No, I don't remember us ever talking about a signature on the other side.
No, just the amount. Just put the amount in your side.
Just put the amount, and the only thing the lavush is adding is, in addition to the amount, you put in also the date, the due date of when the cash is due. No, because if you mean the borrower, yeah. Right.
Whatever's written on the front stuff, as long as it's in the same.
Right. So that was not the practice. The practice was for the guy to sign his name on one side and to put the amount and the due date on the other side. And then the body of the text, which was, all the wherefores and the how fors, that was done on the side that he signed his name. You just filled it in afterwards, after he signed his name. And that was done in order to give a borrower the efficiency of being able to borrow the money, walk away, and trust the creditor that he's going to fill it in properly afterwards, but also not leaving himself open to forgery. So that's the case that we're talking about. Okay, we'll continue Mirza Hashem tomorrow. Have a great day, everybody.